You're looking at some of the approximately 20,000 fairgoers who attended this year's Texas Book Festival last weekend in Austin. 85 exhibitors were featured, including George Nelson, who wrote, illustrated, and self-published a book about the Alamo. Our cameras caught up with him at his exhibit.
George Nelson, you're the author and publisher, is that right, of this book, The Alamo, An Illustrated History?
Right, and the illustrator.
And the illustrator. Tell us about this book.
Well, I started this book almost 1970, about 30 years ago. I was interested in trying to do an overall in-depth history of the site through time, the evolution of one spot of land, how it evolves from human use and human changes. And the one thing, the advantage of the Alamo is, it's a well-known spot that had a lot of people make records of it, photographs and things, and also way before the famous battle, it was a Spanish mission for 75 years, and they kept enormous records, and it was a Spanish and Mexican fort, and they kept records. And so what I tried to do was take advantage of whatever bureaucratic archival records, and then being an artist also and an archaeologist, I wanted to try to show how the artists and photographers were actually probably better historians than the people who write stories, because the stories become very heavily loaded as to whatever social or political faction that's telling the story, whereas an artist or photographer, it's just trying to deal with an image. And so luckily the images allow us to sort of study this one place through time.
So this had been something you'd been wanting to do for a while, and you just ended up settling on the Alamo.
Yes and no. I was an art student at the time when I began it, and I was having to take a lot of art history classes, and I began to learn how to simply analyze images, and that you can do that. I didn't even know you could, that it was a process. And then as a person interested in archaeology, I was learning that most sites, or many sites, have many components. They've gone through many periods, and so what I wanted to do was to try to show graphically, visually, something rather than using words. And therefore the images, to me, I was always interested in old maps and pictures, as many people are, and so what I wanted to do was, I got the idea, well, no one has ever written a biography of the site. It's always been a story of the battle. So what I tried to do was to show it in context, and also have an opportunity for people to actually look at the images themselves and draw their own conclusions.
And we'll take a look at some of the images in the book, but first there's a very large image right behind you. What is this?
This is one of 4 paintings I have done of downtown San Antonio, showing how the landscape evolved through time. This is the only one that's in the book of the overall landscape. This shows San Antonio in 1836 looking northwest. This is the Alamo. This is the San Antonio River. This part here is now the famous River Walk. This is the town of San Antonio, and as you can see, the layout of the community was, the Alamo was on the east side of town, surrounded more or less by open cornfields and sort of low hills in the background. And the town was about 1,800 people at the time of the battle, and it had been the capital of Texas. And so I was trying to show here the context of the landscape and then how it's set on there, because most of my images are focused of just this area here.
Okay, now there's a tremendous amount of detail in this image, though. How do you go about recreating something from 1830 or before?
What I did was, and I can show you some of the images in the book, I tried to actually take the comprehensive view that the Spanish records, they left maps. They also left land records. We have 250,000 pages of Spanish records from San Antonio alone. And I'll show you some of the types of maps that you can deal with. For instance, here's a 1730s map of San Antonio. The mission's right there and the Spanish fort's right there. We have another map of the Spanish fort, but here's some quite good maps the Spanish made, 1760s. Here's the town, there's the mission, there's the bend in the river, here's the bend in the river. Both these maps were made as part of bureaucratic Spanish colonial empire administration, and one was wound up being captured by the British, and the other one is in Brown University. And so, these things get scattered over time.
How much research, how long did you research?
28 years.
28 years?
But not every day.
What else do you do in those 28 years when you haven't been working on this book?
I'm a sculptor and a painter, but I also specialize in museum work. I'm an archaeologist, and my family are ranchers, and we have a ranch and a cattle feed business. So You wear many hats.
You're also a self-publisher, is that
Yes,
right? How is that going?
Actually, it was quite good. I decided to do it because I thought that the book did have some legs. Here's an interesting picture that you might find. This is one of many series I do. These are a series of pictures of, for instance, the Alamo Church at various phases of time. It evolved tremendously. This is 1845, 1847, 1860s, 1880s, 1910. The thing was this is a good example of what human beings unfortunately really do to an urban area. That if the idea of having preservation of historic sites or landscapes is a relatively modern idea. The people who were involved in the Texas Revolution, the leaders of them, were primarily land speculators, and quite a few of them were land swindlers. And so the problem was, of course, they were interested in land and real estate and commercial enterprises, and therefore the development of this area quite quickly went from being an old Spanish or Mexican compound to becoming an Anglo-American business center with stores and saloons and hotels and things like that. And so very quickly it got basically erased by commercial development. But it just continuously got erased and erased and erased. So there's very little of it actually left, except in the mythological imagination.
Now, I haven't been in Austin very long, but I've been here long enough to learn that if you want to sell books in Texas, there are two topics that will do it, LBJ or the Alamo. Right. How's this selling?
This is selling quite good. I've sold a little over 13,000 of them in a year and a half myself, which is pretty good for self-publishing. And any of you who want to self-publish, I have published in paperback first, the first two printings, and then hardback.
You have paperback and hardcover.
Hardback. And the problem is, of course, hardbacks are more expensive to produce. So from a business way, I make more money off of paperbacks than I do off of this. But anyone who gets in the book business, you do have to learn all the problems of discounting to distributors, people not paying you, things like this. You know, the disillusioning part of the book business, and also the fact that you get returns. You know, you get damaged books that you send out. So it's not all, you know, gravy. But I planned the book for almost 30 years. And so in other words, it wasn't that I simply went to a publisher and said, hoping to get a $100,000 advance. I knew that didn't work for most people. But I would suggest that self-publishing is a profitable thing if you get a niche. You know, if your subject has a particular appeal, whether it be poodle dogs or anything else, you know, whatever you can do, fast cars or whatever, sports. But my book takes a different approach to the Alamo, and it is the most #1 book at the Alamo gift shop. And the fact is that, in other words, you don't have to write a book that totally glamorizes the defenders, which is the traditional approach, but you have to have a quality book. I mean, you have to approach it in a way that appeals to people. And so there's probably dozens of books on the defenders.
Native Texan?
Yes.
Very quickly, what does the Alamo mean for you?
Well, I started out with a very traditional, orthodox view of it, very standard one. Because in Texas, you get Texas history in junior high and all. But I have taken the approach now, having read so much documents, that the Alamo is probably more important, but in a different way. Because what it basically represents, I think, is as the Anglo-Americans expanded across the continent, that this became a rallying cry that justified a lot of actions that now lead to things we have to deal with, such as illegal immigration with Mexico. Mexico used to have to deal with illegal immigration from Anglo-Americans. We're going to have drug smuggling. We're going to have ethnic problems. We're going to have urban sprawl, pollution problems, because this particular enterprise, the colonization of Texas by Anglos, was very successful. But the story we all grew up with was a triumphalist view. In other words, eventually the winners wrote the story to justify, as we always do, but that's not history. Unfortunately, that's propaganda. And so I think that the Alamo will always be a contentious, controversial thing, and you cannot do anything with the Alamo without getting into giant controversies, no matter what because there's factions on all sides that are very prickly.
Texas-sized controversy.
Big ones.
George? Yeah. George Nelson, thank you very much.
George Nelson's book, The Alamo, An Illustrated History, is available in softcover and hardback from Aldine Books. It's available online or in bookstores. Next, we'll bring you one of the panels at this year's Texas Book Festival.